Hi Year 11s, welcome to this will be the third video for preventing infection for term 1 week 11. We'll go straight into it so it's not a long video for you. This time we're going to be looking at factors that determine the spread of infectious diseases. So there's 4 different factors that will determine how fast or how much an infectious disease will spread. Pathogenicity, transmission mechanism, immunisation and population mobility. And you could kind of apply some of these to COVID as well when you're thinking about what restrictions the governments around the world put in place. So pathogenicity. So when we're talking about pathogenicity, basically we're talking about pathogens that can survive for a long period outside of a host. They have adaptations to evade the immune system. They might be antibiotic resistant. They might be fast at reproducing, or their growth rate's really fast, which causes an increased risk of disease. If you have any of those things and you've got a really pathogenic infectious disease, first off, the spread starts to get a lot worse. But then you have to take into account how specifically that pathogen is going to be transmitted. So if they can spread via contact, then that's a lot. If they can only spread only via contact, that's a problem because you need to physically touch someone. So just making sure people don't touch or don't exchange saliva or bodily fluids, that could prevent that virus from passing on. When you're looking at how fast something spreads, as long as a pathogen is spreading faster than the rate of death that it's causing, then it's going to cause an increased rate of infection. So looking at high levels of pathogens in vector blood will increase infection rates. Airborne diseases we know will spread faster, which is why COVID was a problem, because we've got largely populated areas. We have airborne diseases like COVID coming through, much easier to pass on than if it was via contact. Then you need to look at what's the population immunisation rates. So if there's herd immunity, an infectious disease has a lot harder time spreading through the population. You have to take into account there's not a vaccine for every infectious agent. So if you go back to 2020, when there wasn't a vaccine for COVID, the spread of COVID was a lot faster, and it was countries outside of Australia were really suffering because of that. Then you throw in that if a pathogen's fast at mutating, that limits how effective a vaccine is. Now, we've been lucky again with COVID that the vaccine works for all strains, but we do have to take into account they may change to limit the effectiveness of vaccinations. And then lastly, population mobility. And this is the one that probably we saw a lot of in terms of trying to fight COVID from government restrictions. So when there's increased travel, there's increased infections in that area. So when we're talking about periods of war or military operations, there's a lot lower chance of infectious diseases spreading. This is why we shut state borders. This is why we closed off Australia from international visitors, because we were trying to decrease infections spreading across the globe. Now, looking at how infectious diseases can be classified, again, there's a lot of terms here that we can talk about. So when you're talking about a pandemic, this is an infection that is spread worldwide. Really, the last time we saw this was swine flu in 2009, but now we've also got COVID in 2019, 2020, we could also include. In terms of epidemic, this is when an outbreak of an infectious disease occurs suddenly and unexpectedly, and it affects more of the population than is expected. Something like SARS in 2003. An outbreak is where there's a sudden unexpected occurrence of a disease. It might be confined to individuals in one geographical location. For example, Ebola in 2014. It might be endemic, which means it's present in the population within a specific geographical location. Malaria, it could be sporadic, which means it's infrequent and it occurs at irregular intervals, which is something like mad cow disease. So, how do we determine if something moves from an endemic to an epidemic, so expected to unexpected? One, you'd probably want something like mutations that have led to antibiotic resistance. You'd probably need to see antigenic drift or shift, like we talked about in video 1. There'd need to be mutations to make the pathogen be able to synthesize new toxins, which the human race has no immunity to. You would need to have a low immunity level. And then even looking at country status, so for example, third world countries with low sources of medicine and just health, first aid and health services in general, they're going to suffer from these diseases a lot more than other first world countries. But how do we exactly control infection? So We have to identify, track, and stop outbreaks of particular pathogens, and there's a number of ways we can do that. One is to control the carriers of the disease, so often spread by vectors, so talking about malaria with mosquitoes, and we can control those mosquitoes through insecticides or killing mosquitoes, or maybe we can vaccinate humans against malaria. There is a vaccine being trialled for malaria, so that's a really good one to talk about at this point. We could kill the pathogen, so antibiotics and vaccines will kill bacteria, antivirals and vaccines will kill some viruses, disinfectants and antiseptics will kill pathogens on the skin and surfaces outside of the host. But then you still have some, if you're not vaccinated, the virus can move through people and mutate, etc. Bacteria, there's not antibiotics for all bacteria. There might be some generalized antibiotics to help fight bacteria, but sometimes the bacteria will still thrive, especially when you're talking about antibiotic-resistant bacteria like we did in video 2. The immune response of the population. So where there's herd immunity, there's less likely to experience an epidemic. Whereas overcrowded, underdeveloped countries will have more infectious diseases because they don't have clean water, they don't have sanitation, they don't have vaccination programs, they don't have good quality health services. The immune response for those countries is much lower, and hence infectious disease can just tear through that country. And then lastly, quarantining the carriers, which is what we're seeing a lot right now, even me as I'm recording this video, where we force isolation of humans and animals to control the spread of infection. So like COVID, if someone has COVID, we isolate them until that they're no longer infectious, and therefore they're no longer potential hosts and get back into the public. It prevents that virus from spreading beyond that person's confinements or households, etc. That's the end of this PowerPoint. I will see you next term, and have a great time, and make sure you finish your prac write-ups.